this is my perspective of my dad. And there were many perspectives of him. He had 5 children, and all of his children had different and deep and complicated relationships with him, and they changed over the years. And my dad was 58 when I was born, so I knew him for a particular time in his life where he was deeply wrapped up in his work, and then he retired in 1994 when I was 12. And so for the last 6-7 years of his life, he was just alone in the big house, just connecting to his source of the sacred and writing this book. He had a version that would have been publishable in 1989 that was a little more simple, and my sense is that he had published it then, he may have been able to include it in the larger world of transformation that we're all a part of. But because he kept returning and kept rewriting it, he died before it was published, and it was published 8 years after he died, this book. So we didn't even believe that it would exist, and then it manifested into physical form in 2009. And I have a very complicated relationship with this man, because on the one hand he has so much love and compassion and orientation to justice and to all the ways that we come together to figure out what we need to do together. And I think one of the reasons that he had trouble finishing the book on transformation is because he had his own wrangling with whether he was living a transformative life himself in his own relationships, in his relationships with either his first or second wife, in his relationship with his children, and that's a real question, because this is not some dry theory that you apply to distant schemes. This is something that really he wanted to be applicable to every single relationship that we might engage with. So I don't normally teach this theory particularly. His work and his life informs all sorts of ways that I show up in the world, in my own work, in my own art, in the ways that I relate to the people that I love and the people that I have complicated relationships with, like everyone, but the people that are more complicated, more difficult, he has a lot of ways to approach those kinds of relationships too. So I've tended to just say, okay, I hold this and I transmute it into my own ways and my own ways of approaching what's appropriate now. But in honor of his 90th, and that he has, despite all the complicated thicknesses of this book and all the trouble that he had balancing the work that he was writing and the family that he was raising, and paying attention to both at the same time or not. There's so many beautiful gems, as some of you have seen this week on the posts online, that really speak to what we're working on. So I
want to know what it is.
I will get to that now. And if there's any questions at any point, feel free to raise them or interrupt me. I'll get into the theory a little bit, and I'll get into a little bit of. Well, I'll do a quick bio so that you have some sense of that. And when we get to the 60s, we can get into what developed in the 60s, which was the beginning of this. He saw some of the most profound violence and suffering and institutionalized pain of the previous century, of the 20th century. He was born Jewish in Nazi Germany. His parents were atheists, but that didn't matter much to the authorities there. And he was beaten up all the time for being a Jew. He had a pretty traumatic relationship with his parents. And they escaped in 1937, just him and his parents and 2 cousins, and everyone else died. And they managed to escape to New York because they had an uncle that lived in the U.S. And they didn't speak English. My dad had to find them all jobs. My grandparents were hat makers. And he had a very strict, like he wasn't allowed to go out and have friends and do, teenagery stuff. Even in undergrad at UCLA, he basically stayed in and studied, and that was all disrupted by Pearl Harbor and the war. And he was drafted because everybody was, and he had the benefit of being German speaking, so they made him a battalion scout, which means that you sent him deep into Nazi territory to go find out where the Nazis were and then sneak back to let everybody know, which is terrifying. I think I developed some of my sense of direction from him, but I've never had to do it with Nazis involved. So, and he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, which was the largest death count of the entire war. It lasted like 2 months, and he like basically lived on the side of a tank, like not even in the tank, in the middle of winter, as everyone around him died. And he survived. He made it through the whole war. There were a couple of times that were really close, and he didn't like to talk about the war much. He didn't let me have toy guns growing up. He didn't want that to be entering into to my experience. And after the war, he actually spent a few years tracking down some of the Nazis that had tormented him as a child, and bringing them to justice in different ways. I don't think it was like Tarantino-ish justice. I think it was like, courts and tribunals and this kind of thing. But, it was a strange time. And then he started working for the State Department because he thought that would be a place where you could affect change in a real way. But he opened the Near East and North Africa Bureau just as Algeria was happening, just as all of these, places were breaking free from colonial rule and potentially breaking free from sort of their fundamentalist Islamic or traditional societies. But then what he realized was they kept opening up into a space of not knowing what was next, seeing the modern West rising, and not just seeing it rising, but having the Americans meddling in every single thing they possibly could, with only the orientation to, American exceptionalism, only the orientation to oil interests, anti-communist fights. It was such a limited, tiny understanding of what was at stake, and my dad kept running around trying to get them not to, support coups that were throwing whole nations into disarray, into making things worse a lot of the time. John Foster Dulles and his brother, Robert Dulles, were the CIA and the State Department heads, and he was fighting with them he threatened to resign a dozen times. He was always threatening to reveal different things. It was the foundation of Israel. I mean, there's a lot of things that were crucial moments that were happening there that my dad was around for, and he was choosing to be on the side of the struggling, the oppressed, people that had, were yearning to sort of step into their own authority and their own agency in the world, but then the Americans would come and go, nope, that's not fucking allowed. You guys are, only allowed to do these limited options that go along with American interests. And that just became eventually too much. So he he quit and he started working for Princeton University, because at least in the academy he could have a platform. He could have people that, he could have space to explore what he wanted to explore, and a captive, engaged student population to work the stuff out with. And so he started off teaching Middle Eastern studies at Princeton. He had 4 kids by that point. And then as he sort of dropped into what was at stake with these changing cultures in the Middle East, he saw that, okay, so I'll start getting into the theory. My dad sees the ways of life that we encounter at different scales. So that could be your close, your partner, or it could be your friends and your colleagues and your community, or it could be your town, or your bioregion, or your state, or your whole relationship to nation states and the history of the planet. He saw all of these relationships fitting into certain spheres, certain ways of life. And for him, there were, as he developed it more and more and sort of dropped more into all the details of it, these were the only ways of life that were possible. Any experience that you had, you could fit it into one of these either 4 ways of life or 9 archetypal relationships, or, he has a lot in this. He has a lot of onlys and alwayses and nevers, and I always had a little trouble with that.
Always?
I always had a little. Often, usually.
Occasionally.
And so did his other, I recognize some of the, he covers his ass a lot in this book, in that he's always saying, this is not a final theory, this is not the one theory to cover them all. I have this sense of what this means, of how these ways of life fit into the grand dramas that go on growing, but open to the possibility that new ways of life might present themselves. I believe in everybody's ability to engage with this theory actively in their life, test it against their experience. Don't believe me, don't just hold. He was against leaders and gurus and this. He wanted us all to be guides that help each other. There will be times when I'm able to guide you with something, and times when you're able to guide me with something, and that's how we transform one another. It's not top down, it's not hierarchical, it's not once and for all, though he does use a lot of that language, and that makes sense because he was a man of that century. Not only was he born in 1924, he returned as a conquering man of the winners of World War II, and those men of that generation came back and basically set up America in the 50s in the image of their conquering hero archetype. So that meant a lot of sexism. It meant a lot of still colonial perspectives. He was better than most by far, but he was still a man of his generation.
As
yes?
a man of his generation, you're referencing where he says it's not my way or your way, or it might be I'm curious about, I know you're going to share more about his theory, but
Yeah.
but where is that? What is that? How does he frame that? And how does he talk about that? Because in a lot of the quotes that you've shared, there's such an emphasis on non-hierarchy.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with conversations with my mom, and conversations with my brother Nick, and even conversations with me when I was old enough to start sort of engaging with it. Because all of us were saying, "Hi, it seems like you're saying that there's only these possibilities, and don't there seem to be other options?" And also, my mom, of course, came out of the 60s, the women's rights movement, the anti-war movement. She was a hippie. My dad was 23 years old already by the time he was born. Hey, welcome. I'm just doing a little bio, and then we're going to get into more of the theory itself. And feel free to jump in, ask questions. We're easy here. Yeah.
So he was more hierarchical before he met your mom?
Yeah, I think he was. He was a little. It took him a little while to get out of the men, women, men are this, women are this. It took him longer to sort of get into the. Actually, these are archetypal dramas that we all enact in different ways, and feminism, and that. I mean, that all didn't, I think, show up for him until the late 70s, early 80s at least. So. And even that relationship with spirit, it's interesting looking at I'll pass them around. I have some of the early versions of the work. This is from the 60s and 70s and different notes. He did all of his notes on yellow line paper and then stapled them all together. And they're crazy. I have so many different folders. I just brought a few of them that I thought you guys might find interesting. So back to the theory, coming out of his encounters all over the Middle East with these cultures where there were very strict traditional religious societies that at different times, either because of the removal of the colonial power or because of whatever was going on in the particular history of that culture, were coming to a place where where those relationships, which my dad would call emanational relationships, were breaking open. Now, an emanational relationship would be something, it could be like you and your parents, or you and your boss, or you and the president. It's anybody with whom you give over your authority. And we all have that. We agree, start off with something like that with our mom, or our dad, or our teacher, or but and for some people that can carry you a whole lifetime of this is a very direct, clear, this person knows what's up, and I am doing my best to live up to that, but I am here and they are there. And also that can break open, and it can break open violently and terrifyingly, and people can be at a loss as to what comes next when you have something, a way of life that persists over generations and thousands of years that in our time start shifting and breaking open, because you see there are other possibilities, there are other ways to engage with your own agency, engage with your own possibilities of freedom and relationship that aren't dependent on this one figure making all the decisions. So then what he saw happening was, as these relationships, as these cultures, as these individuals were breaking out of emanational relationships, they were moving into incoherence. And incoherence in this case is a world comprised of fragments. A lot of us would recognize some incoherent relationships in our lives here, because something like capitalism, for instance, which is a very overarching way of life, something that we all, in our own ways, are either taking for granted completely or trying to wrangle with in our own lives. But the reduction of our whole being, all the capacities and all the beauties of ourselves as humans, to just what we do, to just how much we make. It's the first thing we often ask people: what do you do? Well, that's a small part of of my being. I sell honey, but there's a lot more to what I do and what I care about and what I want to do. And so
you wrote about that.
So he saw incoherence as what often arises when these emanational original relationships break down. And for him, there's a very strict and somewhat linear, though you can bounce around in it. There's different scenes and acts that you move through. So you always start in emanation, and then depending on what happens, you can move into the set. Each scene has 2 acts, and you move from one to the next, and then in that act you can get arrested in that act, and you can't you just get stuck, or you break free, but you maybe break free in a way that leads you to something else that's complicated and difficult, like incoherence. The other two, I'm talking about the 4 ways of life as he understood it. So the first one's emanation, second one's incoherence. The other 2 are deformation and transformation. So deformation would be something like destructive death, war, drugs, obliterating oneself, suicide, murder, all of the sort of as you have incoherent worlds where we're all seeing, okay, I'm only a little this, I'm only a little this, where do I exist? Sometimes what comes up is dark and death oriented, and so one of the ways, the directions you can turn when you don't know what's going on and you don't know what you're comprised of is in that direction. The other possibility, and this can arise at any point along the way, is transformation. And he sees transformation as the fundamental, maybe the only truth of the universe. That things change, that things transform, that we have at our core this availability to transform at any point. And he gets into some really beautiful elucidations of different archetypes and archetypal relationships and different ways of orienting to what's going on in your life and what your options are and how you might orient to transformation. He was the way he would describe this as best becoming available would be to empty oneself and then be able to be renewed.
So the relationships in and of themselves could be archetypal?
They always are. Yeah, he saw them.
What are examples of the archetypes you would?
Well, I can show you. Deformation, transformation is 9 archetypal relationships is chapter 8. So they are performance and capacity. Yeah, feel free to grab a book if you want to flip through, and I'll hand out these and we'll go over some. That's all right. Performance and capacity is compared to power.
Performance and capacity.
Yeah, so he draws a few. There's a few really interesting distinctions that he draws between different. So one is power versus capacity. And in this culture, in the dominant culture, we tend to only count as powerful or not powerful. And it's only about the striving for power, and if you don't have power, you better get some power, and if you're powerless, you're pretty fucked. Yes? I could look it up, but I think that... Where's the Mason? I think he really saw it as there is the potential for power that you draw from for your own soul's calling, but a lot of the power is this distorted greed and only power at the expense of someone.
Power over.
Oh yeah, only power over, exactly. And the distinction that he's drawing between power and capacity is that capacity is something that you're born with. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to fight for it. You don't have to... I mean, sometimes you do fight for it. But capacity is something that we all have available to us, that is replenishable, that is available to show up in many, many different forms. Power is limiting and deconstructing and deformative as it shows up a lot in the world. Does that help answer a little? So another distinction he'd make would be between belief and faith. That's one of the quotes that I sent out. And he saw belief as you give yourself over. It's once again an emanational relationship, whereas faith is something that you build, something that you continually test and examine and that generates trust and generates participation. Another one that he was distinguishing between...
It seems like all of these things like one of them doesn't include transformation and the other one does. Like to maintain power, you're not open to change in relationships.
No, in fact, it's a threat to your power.
To experience capacity is to constantly regulate and be open to your relationship, to your environment and yourself.
Yeah.
And have that experience of drawing upon something, which is kind of fluctuating.
And our shared capacities. Yeah, exactly. So just to get a little bit back, there's emanation as an archetype, there's subjection, isolation, buffering, direct exchange, autonomy. T is a long thing on autonomy. Incoherence, transformation, deformation. In our dominant way of life, archetypal relationships increase or decrease our power, or render us powerless, but they give us no shared capacity. So yeah, the reason I think that I see this as valuable, and not just a strict theory that we, either adapt or don't, is that I think that it's true that in all of these different encounters that we have in our work, in the work that we do as integral ecologists, or as the work that we do as people who care about the earth and care about sharing it and care about breaking us into new healing relationships, is that you might encounter a person or an institution in an emanational relationship or breaking free from one. You might encounter someone who is identifying themselves or the situation only by fragments. And you might be able to identify this as this is incoherent. And what are the underlying forces at work? What are the underlying archetypal relationships? What's at stake together underneath all of this? And then you might encounter people in deformation, and you might encounter people who are practicing transformation and be able to teach one another about that too. So it doesn't as much for me matter that he wanted this to cover all the bases, and so he made it. He as the decades progressed of him writing this, he made it thicker and thicker and more encompassing. And in each sentence he wanted to say transformation as a way of life, or as an archetype, or as a thing. He wanted to have all of the bases covered, so that if anybody came in from this side or this side, he could say, I thought of that, and it fits in here, fits in there. I like that. I think that that was something that compelled him, but there's so many different lives and so many different stories and so many different perspectives, and he'd be one of the first people to say that we need all of those perspectives, and we don't need to be coerced or hoodwinked or forced into any way of life. It's about dropping into what matters for us, what moves us, what is passionate and available for us, and then coming up with how to join together to increase the amount of love and compassion and justice in the work that we do.
Just having read the introduction 20 minutes ago, what he laid out makes intuitive sense to me, that the first human societies that came together and formed cities that were governed by chieftains or kings or whatever, they were emanationist societies whose order was based upon giving authority over to this transcendent power that rules over everything. And then when that breaks down, which inevitably it will, because change and transformation is the nature of things, there's a period of incoherence.
Oh yeah.
And what really stuck with me from the 20 pages that I read was just that what's bringing the world together right now, that's allowing all the world's population, no matter what culture we come from, to share in a sense of being human, is incoherence.
Yeah.
It's the incoherence.
Yeah. That's true.
Of the emanationist scheme that is collapsing all around.
It's true. It's like that broke open.
So we're
seeing okay, we don't need to live under the thumb of one ruler or one way of life. or under the boot on the neck. I mean, there's a lot of ways that emanation enforces itself.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, yeah, we're all. He would distinguish between this sense of the autonomous individual,
Right.
sort of free from interconnected relationships.
Uh-huh.
But it can feel that way as you break open and say, okay, where do I exist? How do I identify myself? How do I fit in?
Right.
And that's incoherence. And and a lot of our dominant ways of life, like capitalism, like liberal democracy, like our food system.
Yeah.
It's based on invisibilities. It's based on invisible animals. It's based on invisible depleted ecosystems. It's based on invisible.
Yeah.
So unless we're including all of those, then it's incoherent. Then it's fragments. And if we can identify where we exist, where those voiceless are, where the invisible are living, and work together to give to provide space for those voices to be heard.
So
emerge onto the global stage.
Right. It seems like in a situation of incoherence like that, we need theory. Maybe not the theory, but we need theories.
Yeah. We don't need a capital T theory, but we need different frameworks that we say, this worked for me.
If capitalism functions by maintaining that incoherence, it's being able to theorize and give order to an unjust situation that will allow us to move beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems like, we always say don't think, act. But maybe
you gotta have both.
You
can't have just one or the other. You have to include, and that's what's sort of amazing about the theory is it's theory and practice. Mm-hmm. This is a long title, by the way.
Yeah.
He had a few different titles over the course of the 40 years, but
what is reason?
Yes, of course. Transforming the personal, political, historical, and sacred in theory and practice.
Transforming everything.
It's transforming everything. It could have been transformation. We had some versions of it, but I picked the cover art.
I like it.
Yeah.
Is that the image that you took?
I didn't take this image.
It looks like millions of lamps.
Yeah, that's a lot of lamps, right?
Are you selling these copies?
I am not. I will lend them out.
Can they be sold?
Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon. They're on Amazon. Yeah. It was so amazing. Oh my god, I got it from Amazon before the publisher sent us the box of them, because I was like, it's on Amazon. That's the picture I took. What? That yellow is the same yellow as my living room when I was growing up. Okay, and then they just mailed it to me.
Nice.
And I opened it and I was like, because it took fucking 40 years. He died. We never thought it would exist, and then it exists, and we read it, and it's a little dense. It's a little hard to read some of it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, then does that make it a failure? Does that make it he has hundreds
Why would it be a failure?
Because it's hard to read.
He wanted it not to be esoteric, right?
It's true, and there's so many dense readers that we don't study in our program because they're used.
And so
Steiner.
in picking the parts to Kant.
Not dense at all.
I can't even deal with Kant. In picking out what I wanted to post, it's like, okay, here's the section on capitalism, or here's the section on transformative love. Okay, that is a dense ass paragraph. That no one ever will want to read through that or that. Oh, Dad, whoa, beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's what I was so intrigued by in the quotes that you did post is, of course I know they're not all the book, but
they're
what is in them I'd like to honor because I feel like when I read them, I'm invited to participate in the world as myself and simultaneously be in healthy relationship. And for a writer and a thinker and someone of spiritual practice to be able to put that into words right now is really important to me because of people like Thomas Berry, who said that's what's needed now is not transcendence but inscendence. And I feel And I recognize incendence in your dad's, in those quotes that you put on Facebook.
Can you define incendence?
Incendence, finding the sacred through not transcending reality, but through going deeper into everyday reality and acknowledging systemic relationships that we're always interacting with, personal relationships, interior relationships. And I think that that's what I was caught by, was in so many of the just paragraphs, your dad hit upon multiple places in which we plug into the world and able to give voice to them in a way that's not too simple or too complex. At least in the way I like it. And I think that's amazing. Like I strive so much to be able to do that with my words. And I really I feel I just, that's what struck me about each one of those quotes that he read, was that even with all of his shadow in mediating relationships and stuff, if I just looked at those quotes, they're amazing. And the man who could see that and feel that and put that into words, like, I'm so happy that he did that, and he didn't stop, and he worked probably knowing that he was going to make mistakes, as we all do.
Well, the knowing that he could make mistakes was why he didn't publish. Because he kept going back and going, okay, this isn't quite right. And it's true. There's a number of places in this book where he's very clear on, we are not talking about some transcendent future. We're not having an eye towards the utopian world that we're all gonna just move into willy-nilly. It's real work. It's real struggle. There's no rapture. No, there's no rapture. I know. I'm sorry to let you down. It's real struggle, and it takes generations. It took generations to get us here. It takes generations to get us out of here. If we have that time.
It seems like what he was pointing to is the fact that coherence requires a kind of relationship with the sacred, but the old relationship of emanation doesn't serve us anymore. So we need to find an inscendent sacred rather than a transcendent sacred.
And he touches a little bit on ecology and on the relationship with the earth, which is amazing because I love it. So I'm glad to see it in there. I think that for him it was a lot. You could tune in on connections through sex. You could tune in on connections through
farmers markets.
Probably through farmers markets, he just saw the potential in all these different ways of engaging, and real potential to engage with actual problems that we're facing today in the here and now.
So what is the potential? Like, what is the goal? What is, if we were to do what he was asking of us, what would that look like? What is he inviting in?
I mean, there's the specific stages and acts of sort of like, you land on a scene, and there are ways that he would want you to specifically engage, and specific questions that you can ask. What would allow us to come together on this? What is working for us? What isn't working for us? What is serving us, and what are we holding on to that is fruitful, and what are we holding on to that is destructive? And coming at it with all of that. But ultimately, it's about having an eye towards transformation. Having an eye towards, towards the fundamentally new and better. Now, that sounds like another one of those sort of always never kind of statements. But it's not a his or my deciding this is fundamentally better. It's the, hey, does this seem better to us? Yeah, does this seem not just incrementally new, but fundamentally, drastically new?
Right.
Happy birthday. I'll come down to the water and find you.
I'm really glad that I heard it. It feels etheric in lots of ways.
I'm glad.
And I'm going to buy the book now. 'Cause
Okay, awesome.
Maybe we could start
I feel connected.
a reading group.
It's here. Yeah. Oh God.
Yeah.
We could have a reading group of your dad's book.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll see you in a few.
I'll see you soon, Josh. Happy birthday.
So I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
For sure.
I see that he references Cornell West.
Yeah, so my mom and Cornell West came up at the same time. They were in the same cohort under Sheldon Wolin. Do you know Sheldon Wolin? Sheldon Wolin was his and Cornell and I think Wendy Brown, who is Judith Butler's partner. Sheldon Wolin is like a major. His last book was about democratic totalitarianism, inverted totalitarianism. Hey, welcome. So, what was you asking? What you?
Oh, I just was gonna. Yeah, so you were mentioning that your mom.
Oh yeah, right. So they were all at Princeton at the same time and hanging out. My Cornell West, yeah, was very close with both of my parents. And there's a number of folks in there that he came up with. Elaine Pagels was one of his colleagues who wrote amazing books on the devil and Jesus and all kinds of stuff.
Gnosticism.
It's interesting because Princeton, as limited a worldview as they tended to pursue, which it tended to be pretty economics and research-based, scientifically reductionist. He did find a community there. He did find people who really resonated. And what an amazing thing. And we're very, very blessed in our community that we have people who wrangle with all of these questions from all of these beautiful perspectives. But someplace like central New Jersey, you catch who you catch. And there's remarkable folks that have come through his class, and there's people who when you run into them, they say, "Oh, Manfred, oh, what a soul, what a," and then there's people who say, I remember I woke up, I had a nightmare one time that I read a history book and I was listed as a minor contemporary of Manfred Halpern.
As a what?
As a minor contemporary of Manfred Halpern. Like, people, it's a nightmare. Like, people were like, this is some wacky, weirdo, like foo-foo theory, and my stuff is legit and serious, and Manfred Halpern is a little,
Right.
And, Manfred considered himself among the great mountain peaks of the, history of philosophy. Jung and Hegel and
Halpern.
And Halpern, right there. and partly that's why he didn't care that he didn't publish it before he died.
But that's kind of, I mean, in a way, you could see that as him putting himself up with them, or if we were to use the parts of his theory that you elucidated, it would be bringing them down to us.
Sure.
And allowing us all to have a resonant and important voice when we are talking about what's useful for society.
And even though he had a bit of a sort of fantasy of Halpernians in the, around, 100 years from now, all, sort of worshipping at the pillar of the great man. He also wasn't interested in disciples, and one of the consistent things you hear from his students when you encounter people who were students of his is that they all say, he never insisted that his way or his theory was the way. He always encouraged us to discover our own relationship with it, to practice it in our lives, to let it emerge from our own sacred core. And that's a mark of a really good teacher, is that you don't have to gather people under you, that you support them arising in their own unique ways, in their own fullness, whether it lines up with your sense of it. Yeah, exactly. Or takes it down. Yeah, exactly.
Anything else you want to add before the camera battery dies?
I love him. I love him, and he was a complicated man, and especially being his son, I saw many sides of him. Very, very silly sides, and weird, funny, hilarious sides. He could make an entire room crack up, and he would walk into a room and everybody would go, oh, and then he could just command. He just had a way of and he was also tormented in certain ways. He had deep, profound struggles that he had through his whole life, and that we were right there in the middle of, because he was working them out in the living room. And so he would have been 90. He would have had so much to contribute. If he had been of sound mind and body at 90, he would have been so weird and so engaged with what was happening on the planet, and would have so many ideas about how we could participate, and he would love that we were posting on him on Facebook.
Can we sing happy birthday to him?
Yeah. And I'll pass around the thing. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Manfred. Yeah. Happy birthday to you. No, he liked that. He would like that.